We are completely surrounded by the impacts of climate change. Stories of fires, natural disasters, and record-breaking temperatures dominate the news. It's almost impossible not to feel anxious at the state of the climate. And if you're anything like me, this fear will just have you in a state of paralysis, lurching between feeling like any effort is futile or just trying to close your mind to what's happening. But that's not helpful. So how can we take our climate guilt and anxiety and turn it into something positive that is actually going to be helpful? Well, Associate Professor Leslie Davenport is the woman we need to speak to. She is a pioneer in this space and she's a climate psychology consultant. Leslie, when did you start to personally notice your own climate guilt, and when did you get into this field?
Oh boy. Well, it goes strangely because it's, there's so much recent news. But for me, I would say the beginnings were almost 20 years ago.
Yeah.
And
wow.
It's hard to pinpoint a single incident. I've just always been interested in ecology and environment, and it's something that I just stay up on. And there came a point when, in reading particularly about the trajectory of climate change, that it just shifted from information down into this body-based, heartfelt, visceral understanding of just how dangerous of a trajectory that we're on. And I made a decision at that point to turn as much as I could in my personal and professional life toward addressing it.
And we are grateful to you. Thank you. It's wonderful work that you do. So tell me, why is it important that we do talk about these emotions that we're having about climate change?
Well, the first thing that I think is really important to understand, and you talked a little about this even in your introduction, is that it is triggering feelings of anxiety, feelings of anger and frustration at the lack of action, often at the government policy levels, grief at the losses that we're experiencing and witnessing. And it's really important to know that all of those feelings, and there's even more we haven't mentioned, are indicators that you're empathetic, that you care about what's happening, that you're paying attention to what's happening, because those are built into us as humans to feel outrage at injustice or boundaries being crossed, to feel sadness and grief when there's losses. And if we try and turn that off or turn away from it, first of all, we can't really do it. We're just pushing it underground and it comes out in other ways, which we could talk about too. But the very first step is just letting yourself be with what you're feeling. And it's hard to do. We don't like to be uncomfortable. We don't like to feel like we're moving toward overwhelm or to feel powerless, all the things that climate change can trigger. But if we pause and say, okay, I understand why this is rising up. These are signals to me and to everyone that things are out of balance, and I'm going to use them as guides to help guide my actions and what I need to do.
It makes so much sense. And so one of the things that makes climate change really hard to deal with it for us as humans is the uncertainty of the future. Why is that so difficult for us?
Well, I hate to say this, but our brain kind of works against us in this regard.
It does that.
And it actually goes back to our evolutionary psychology and our survival impulse. And the idea is that we're programmed to look for dangers. That's how we stayed alive. That's how we were able to escape threatening situations and to do what we needed to do to keep going. And so one thing to be aware of is that bad information. And when I talk about this, I'm not in any way minimizing the severity of climate change, but it's important to know that threats, risks, scary stuff amplifies 3 to 5 times more in our brain and in our nervous system than do neutral or pleasant events. So it's upsetting enough, and our brain is amplifying it. Now, the other thing that the brain does in this regard is that it also has this kind of like this overwhelm monitor. And when we're in this place of just perpetual sense of distress, it kicks us out of that. And it's hard to describe, but for those who study the brain with the right kind of machinery, there's parts of our brain that literally go offline and other parts that come on. And part of this is also survival. If we were in a constant state of distress and overwhelm, again, we couldn't get dinner on the table for our family and get to work and pay the bills and have fun sometimes. So it's very hard for a brain that's oriented toward the present moment. Let's do what we need to do now. Let's stay safe right now, and take in this larger, very complex, longer arc of a timeline realities. And to do both. And so I'm not saying there's no hope here. There's things we can learn to do, but it's a very particular challenge to be at this place in our human development, and our brain hasn't really caught up for how to deal with it well.
Yeah, absolutely. I love the way you explain that. And it makes so much sense when you kind of process it in that way. It makes so much sense why so many of us are feeling in this way. We're familiar we're familiar with anxiety now in other parts of our life. You know, it's a term that we talk about a lot, and anxiety towards other areas of our life. But climate change requires a different response, right, to other kinds of anxiety that we process. What is that response, and why is it so different?
Well, there's many situations in life that can trigger anxiety. Most of those circumstances, perhaps not all of them, but the majority of them, if we exclude climate change for a moment, are things that often resolve, or we can adapt to them in a different way, or, there's sort of this arc of distress, and then we find a new way to deal with it and go on with our lives. The problem with climate change is, we're talking about the fact that we know the impacts are going to get worse, at least for a while. There's still this effort to make the changes we can. And the scientists say every degree of warming or percent of degree that we can stop from happening is worth the fight. But even if we're really successful at that, there's a certain momentum to the warming of the atmosphere that will continue even before it starts to come down. So all the things we know that are happening, the rising seas and the heat domes, and of course the fires and the droughts and the floods and all the kinds of effects that we see, we can't tell ourselves, well, let's just, get through this because it's going to be better next week or next year. So here's one way I'm approaching it. I'm redefining what psychology describes emotional resilience.
Yeah.
The old way of thinking about it, the conventional way, and what you'd probably still find to look it up, is how quickly can you bounce back to that baseline? Something disrupts your life, it's disturbing. How quickly can you return? And that's a measure of your resiliency. Without that ability to return, because we're standing on moving ground, I say that emotional resiliency is the capacity, growing the capacity to be even more present, grounded, open-minded, open-hearted, in the face of increasing distress. That tendency to want to numb ourselves or step back or pretend it's not happening for a while. And that's not to say it's not smart to take breaks, but to know that we have to, rather than closing our heart and our mind to it, make both of those even bigger so that we can tolerate being in this process while we're working on making things better.
Yeah. And I guess that, because the big difference is that we're not trying to resolve that feeling or put it away or ignore it or, act like it's not happening. We actually have to do something about this. So you tend to encourage people to reach that middle ground between the denial and the idea that all's not lost.
Yes. Well, yes, that is on the thought level. We'll come back to that, but let's stay a moment more on the emotional level. Yeah. So there's something in trauma work and trauma studies called the window of tolerance or the zone of resilience. Yeah. And the idea is that, and I'll just say it stretches, it contracts. It's not the same for everyone. But the idea is that we can live pretty stressful lives, have a lot of responsibility, deal with a lot of things. But if there's just too many, or there's some that are just too big, and it moves us outside of our window of tolerance, we either lash out, get really reactive, not really possible to even have a very fruitful conversation until we kind of come back into our zone of resilience. Or the opposite end of the spectrum, we check out, we numb out, we isolate, we stonewall, can't have any conversations that way either. Just one is more externalized and the other is a withdrawal, an internalized one. So one thing we can all do is get really familiar with our own window of tolerance. Can we identify when we're getting towards those edges? And in those times, intervene with whatever helps calm our nervous system and bring us back to ourselves. And that might be going for a run. It might be calling a friend. It might be doing yoga. It might be a mindfulness practice. It might be kickboxing. Skateboarding. I mean, it's really important to know that it doesn't have to look like one thing. It's not all about going to an ashram or, even though
Zen yogi master.
Yes, I do actually myself enjoy those sort of quieting practices. Yeah. But I know many people who feel better if they go for a run. Or I had a 13-year-old client who had the skateboarding is like, she said, I have to be in my body. I have to really tune into my environment. I'm kind of have this flow as I'm on the board, and that just brings her right back.
And are there any tools that we can use, in those moments when we perhaps can't go and take half an hour or take an hour? Are there any things that we can do in that moment, in that instant, to kind of bring us back to that calmer nervous state?
Well, breath practices really are powerful because, one, they're with us all the time, the ability to shift our breath and become aware of our breathing. It's free, and it's quick. Once you know a breath practice that has a calming influence on the nervous system, you can make a big shift anywhere from, say, 3 to 8 minutes. And I'll just describe a really common one if people aren't familiar. So you set the pace that's comfortable because you don't want it to feel like a strain if you're counting your breath. But you breathe in for 4 counts, you hold your breath for another 4 counts, and then you slowly exhale for 8. And there's different variations. I like the one where you breathe in through your nose for 4, hold for 4 at the same pace, breathe out through your mouth for 8, kind of like you're almost blowing out a candle, like a yeah.
I love that. That sounds really helpful.
It's remarkable how much our breath is connected to our nervous system. So, yeah, because when we're stressed, we tend to our breath tends to be rapid and shallow. And that's sort of an after effect of having a distressed nervous system. But because they're so connected, we can intervene at the breath side and kind of reverse that, and it'll calm the nervous system down.
Absolutely. So if we've managed to, work through that state, and I guess one of the big things you talk about as well is that, this is a marathon, not a sprint. Like we kind of have to really regulate and take care not to burn out and get into that sense of overwhelm, because it's really not helpful.
Yes.
So is that what's going to help us through that and kind of work at a sustainable level, is kind of figuring out where we need to keep our emotions and our nervous system so that we can continue?
Yes, that's half. So working directly with the distress, and there's other ways to do that too, like notice our thoughts. If we're telling ourselves it's too late, nobody cares, nobody's doing anything, I'm too small to make a difference. While there aren't reasonable concerns in that, if that's just the story we're running in our minds, it's going to make it very hard to feel, well, how can I make a difference and what can I do? And so it's important to not to sugarcoat anything, but just to notice if there's a mental habit, an internal story that gets triggered when we're feeling upset, and to question it a little bit.
Yeah.
But the other half, so all that is working directly with our feeling of upset. The other half is finding some way, and we can look again at the many variations, that we can help be part of creating a safer, healthier world. And it's really got to go hand in hand. And some people are really good at one half, like there's a lot of youth activists who are out there doing a lot of work, but they have a hard time taking care of themselves. And so there's a high level of burnout. There's other people who just are really into how can I do self-care and feel better, but really haven't found a way to be engaged and be part of this larger effort where I truly believe everyone has a role. And maybe I'll just talk more about some of the ways that can look.
Yeah.
I think that every area of human activity, every profession, needs to be in a process of reevaluating itself in terms of sustainability. So, for example, if a person is a school teacher, there's a lot of influence they might have with kids. What if they started an after-school green club where kids could come and work on projects and talk about how they feel and what are their questions, or field trips or projects that had a conservation theme? If someone's an artist, how can they use their medium to communicate? Sometimes it's more powerful than words. And, for you, using this opportunity to talk about this is a beautiful, important way that there's a significant contribution. I have someone in the medical field who's attempting to start a waste reduction initiative because there's this battle between, sanitation and hygiene and just the disposable, high level of disposable items that perhaps can be done a different way. So that's just, scratching the surface. I'll share one more example from my life. So before I moved as much into these public arenas as I'm doing now with education and workshops, and I was primarily doing therapy, I was thinking, well, it's important for people and people are getting helped, but is one-on-one fast enough, big enough, given the size of this? And I had a client who had a very large platform, but had a speaking phobia.
Oh, wow.
And so, we did our work, in this little closed room for a series of weeks, and it was successful and helpful to him. And so now he's able to be on that stage with 3,000 people in the audience, that gets recorded and reaches even larger numbers. And so, what felt like such a small part, actually we're all linked in all these ways, right? That's like this invisible link that has this impact that's rippling out. And I think many things look like that on their own, they might feel small, or am I touching enough people? Is it making enough of a difference? But just imagine, if everyone within their sphere of influence even was talking about it more, acknowledging the feelings, raising the questions, what can we do? That it really can be this collective elevation that starts to have this synergistic impact.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I think that's really a lovely way to head. It's going to make a massive difference. So throughout this, we kind of touched on it a little bit, but this is hard work and it can be overwhelming. What are some of the signs that we might be approaching burnout, and we might have kind of reached outside of those zones of tolerance for ourselves?
Yes. It can show up in a number of ways. One is to start to notice if it's interfering with, other kinds of life functions. Is it affecting your relationships? Can you sleep at night? Mm-hmm. Are you able to eat in a way that feels healthy and right for you? With younger kids who can't always articulate their thoughts and feelings, it often will show up as stomach aches, headaches, maybe behavioral acting out. With teens, there might be that draw towards self-harm or substance abuse, even because of that desire to numb, not know where to go with these things. And another one is, if you've been working at being more involved and being more present, if the stories and what's happening stop touching you emotionally, there may be a kind of numbness or that it's time to step back briefly and do a deeper level of self-care. I'll say for myself, one of the things that helps me know that I'm, my heart's still engaged is when I do read that, some bill didn't pass, or I hear about some disaster, I often will have this welling up of feelings, and I give myself time for the tears or the anger or whatever it is to kind of ride, come through me like a wave. And in a way, I wouldn't want that to completely go away, because I know I'm tuning in to this very important, human experiences.
Yeah, that's a really insightful way of looking at it. And so if we are working through this with children too, what's the best way of talking to them about it and kind of helping them with it without overwhelming them too?
Yes, you asked such good questions.
Thank you.
Because it really is a big area. It often feels like a dilemma for parents and teachers too, because there's this, built-in desire to protect our kids, keep them safe. And we think that we can sort of shield them, or we certainly want to, from the difficulties of life. The problem is either the direct impacts that they're experiencing or going to experience, like, their sport event was canceled because it was too hot, or the air was unhealthy, or the favorite lake is closed down because of a toxic algae bloom, or, even the evacuations that have had to occur. And if not that, most kids are pretty smart, and they'll overhear a conversation, or they'll hear something on the news, even unintentionally, the TV's just on or the radio's on. And so unless they can ask their questions or express their concerns, it gets worse for kids because one, they might have the information really wrong in the sense of, is my house going to flood tonight? Can I go to sleep? Because if they're, 6, 7, and they just know this is happening, and maybe it's a town they've heard of or visited, they might think that's happening now. So you don't want to, parents, it's important parents don't just download a lot of bad information. It's not, we wouldn't want to do to kids what we're faced with, bad news and then a bit more bad news. But, it's going to come up naturally. And to not be afraid to say, I'm really interested in this too. I really want to hear what your questions are. If I don't know the answer, let's go figure it out. I care about this. Let's figure out what we can do together to make a difference. Not that it has to become the only family activity, but it really matters to kids if the people in their lives, the adults in their lives that they care about most, express care about the environment. It's very reassuring to them. And to know that there's this open forum that if they feel upset or they have a question, there's a place they can come to it. And I'm not sure how it is there, but here there are more and more schools that are also starting to introduce curriculum about climate change, usually around 3rd grade, 4th grade type things. So it's going to be coming in that way too. And the schools don't always include the emotional support. So again, they just may be in a situation of getting information and need a place to talk about it.
Yeah, absolutely. And so if we only remember one thing, if we're, feeling overwhelmed and climate change is getting on top of us, as is likely to happen because there is so much of this about, as we're saying, so much news and so many records being broken depressingly. What should we remember when we're trying to take those negative, heavy emotions of guilt and anxiety and actually turn it into action rather than just becoming overwhelmed?
Well, I guess it would be to summarize that there are the 2 key parts. One is to value your feelings as being your messengers, your allies, to comfort yourself in whatever way works. And then to know that there are many people, just like you, who want clean air, who want clean water, who are ready for change to happen, and that this number is only growing. And that you can find a way to be part of that in whatever way feels natural and possible for you.
And one final question I want to ask is, when we actually start to take action, will that in turn also ease those feelings of anxiety and guilt?
So when we take action, it's empowering. We feel less victimized that things are happening to us when in fact there is a role we can play. And as we've said, there can be this collective momentum for good. The part that makes it difficult is we all want it to happen faster, easier now, yesterday. Yeah. And it does take some patience to kind of stay in it for that long haul and to, again, step back, take a break when we need to, come back even more energized, and know that no single person is likely going to solve this, but it is a collective amplification as we each do our part. And I'll say one more thing, because I've always found this really encouraging. There's an engineer on the faculty of University of Pennsylvania named Damon Centola. He's published some research papers, has a couple books out. And what he has said, he spent more than a decade studying social movements, like what creates meaningful tipping points so that policies come into place or expectations shift. And what he has said is that it's just over 25%. And what I love about that is, often when we're looking at climate change, it's like it's so big and people have all kinds of beliefs about it. And I have found myself saying, well, how am I going to get everybody on board? But it's not going to take everybody. It's going to take, a strong minority, really, to apply enough influence that things will shift, and then it's easy for everybody, right, to have a less fossil fuel dependent society, for example.
Fantastic. Really interesting. Thank you so much, Leslie. I really appreciate you spending the time. I, for one, definitely feel a lot better even after this chat and more capable of actually doing something about it. So thank you.
Thank you so much for having me and for talking about this.
No, it's my absolute pleasure. And you have a book. I know you've written a book for counselors, but you've also got a book that people can read to get more info and a bit more support on this.
Yes, there's a couple books. Well, the one for the mental health field is called Emotional Resiliency in the Era of Climate Change. But to tell the truth, it's written in very friendly terms. It doesn't require any degrees. And it has worksheets, practices, things to actually do. It's not simply ideas. So that's honestly very available to anyone. Last year, I also had a book come out for middle school kids, tweens, called All the Feelings Under the Sun. And it goes back and forth between some age-appropriate climate science and then how to work with the feelings and thoughts and how to find your eco-wise self and the contributions you can make that we've been talking about. And then I've got a book in the works that's coming out in about a year that's for even younger kids around the 8 to 10-year-old range.
Fantastic. Okay, I'm going to put all the links to the show notes in the books that are out right now so people can go and find them. Thank you so much, Leslie.
Thank you, too.
Associate Professor Leslie Davenport is a climate psychology consultant. I'll pop all those links in the show notes, as I mentioned, so you can go and check out Leslie's books and get a bit more support around this, because I know if you're feeling anything like me, you're going to need it, because it does feel overwhelming in parts, but just know that there is help out there and there are things that you can do to change it. It is not completely futile. So thank you. And thank you so much for joining me. I really appreciate it. If you're new here, please make sure you subscribe so you don't miss an episode. And if you're enjoying the series so far, leave me a review. I absolutely love reading them, and it helps other people join our little community, which is always a good thing, surely. Thank you so much. I'm Ed Stott, and I sincerely hope that's helpful.